Hi everyone, we're live. So this is the first of a series of Hangouts we'll be having through Science on Google Plus on developmental psychology. Today is our guest is Dr. Gideon Deák, and he'll be talking to us about his research. So Gideon, can you introduce yourself? What do you do, very briefly?
Yeah. Hi everyone. Glad to be here. Thank you very much, Chris and Bedini, for inviting me to do this. This has been a lot of fun so far. And so I'm Gideon, and I'm in the Department of Cognitive Science at UCSD, where I've been for 14 years. And my degree is in developmental psychology from the University of Minnesota. So I was trained as a psychologist and working as a cognitive scientist. And what else did you want to know?
How did you get interested in development?
How did I get interested? Well, I never thought I was going to be a scientist. I think when I was a kid, I was interested in biology and zoology, but then I was really into music. So I was actually going to be a musician, and I went to music school for a while. And then by chance, I took a couple of psychology classes. Maybe I thought they'd be easy or something, I don't know. And I actually hated the first two psychology classes I took. But for some reason, I was trying to think, why did I do this? I signed up for a third psychology course, and that one was like, we called it biopsychology at the time, kind of intro neuroscience. And it was a great class, and the light bulbs were going off above my head, and it was like, oh, you could explain this stuff in physical terms and really investigate in rigorous ways how behavior happens, so that kind of got me hooked.
In psychology, but what got you into the developmental component?
Right. So the next course I took that I really liked was a developmental psychology course taught by Ken Livingston at Vassar College. And I also, and I can't remember why I did this either, but I signed up for a course which was a practicum where 2 mornings a week we went and worked in classrooms at the campus nursery school.
Oh, cool.
And I had no experience working with little kids before, and so I don't remember why I signed up for that class. Maybe, again, I thought it would be an easy A or something. And I loved it. It was just fascinating working with these 4-year-olds. They were so interesting, and we had great conversations, and I really enjoyed watching their social dynamics. So that was really what got me hooked.
Okay, great. So can you give us a little bit, you have different areas that you're interested in, like cognitive flexibility, word learning. Can you give us a little bit of kind of an idea of what your research program is like in some of the different areas that you study?
Right. So we've done a fair amount of work, as you say, on cognitive flexibility and what we call executive functions or cognitive control, the ways in which we control our thinking to be able to sort of work adaptively in the world, right? So when you have a list of things you have to get done during the day, and you've got to do some multitasking, and there are distractions, there are emails coming in, and that sort of thing. How do you regulate your behavior? How do you decide what to focus on? How do you inhibit distractions? Things like that. And young children can be really bad at these things, right? They tend to focus on things and be hyper-focused and maybe not hear what their parents are saying to them or something like that. So we're interested in how executive functions in general develop, and the part of that we focused on is cognitive flexibility, which is your ability to switch from doing one thing or thinking about one thing to another thing when the situation calls for it. So we've done experimental work on cognitive flexibility, going out to preschools and testing kids in preschools. And we also have done some research on children's word learning, where we again, go out to schools. We teach kids new words. So we'll come up with controlled sets of words and stimuli, and we'll try to see if we can get kids to learn these words as a way of trying to figure out the processes, the cognitive processes by which word learning happens, okay? And then our other research, kind of the other side of what we do, is more diverse. We've been studying how children learn, how infants, I should say, learn social skills, and we use a variety of methods for that. So sometimes we bring infants and their parents into the lab, and we test infants in controlled behavioral tasks, or we collect EEG, that's electroencephalogram, information from kids, and I think we'll maybe talk about that a little later. Yeah. And sometimes we go into homes and we put cameras around, hopefully subtly, and we videotape infants and parents interacting, playing, and then we code in a lot of detail the actions that they're doing while they play. And so we have data sets of hundreds of thousands of actions of parents and infants while they play in real time. And then we do kind of complicated statistical analyses to try to figure out the patterns by which they interact. And we also use computational simulations to test theories about how infants might learn these social skills.
You know, we'll be talking about some of these studies, correct? Maybe the word learning, and you sent me several pictures, for example, the software that you use, coding, timestamps when infants do a certain task, or the mother and child do something. So we'll be posting some of these pictures on the event post after the event's over. But can you tell us about some of your research, maybe some of your word learning studies, or go into a little bit more specifics of some results that you're really, I think you said, stoked about, or really interesting new findings in word learning and parent-child interaction.
Right. Well, one of the things we published recently on children's word learning was this finding that I think surprises people, which is that young children, like 3 to 5-year-old children, are not so good at word learning as people assume. So if you pick up any textbook on child psychology, or parenting book, or book on children learning language, you'll read that children are precocious word learners. They absorb language and learn words like little sponges, and they learn, many, many words every day. And
like fast mapping?
Sorry?
Fast mapping?
Fast mapping, right. This is fast mapping refers to the phenomenon of children being able to, or anyone being able to, learn a word from 1 or maybe 2 exposures to the word. And this is sometimes treated as a sort of mystical learning ability. And we had done a study early on. I had done it with Jennifer Hughes Wagner back in 2003, where we found that 4 and 5-year-olds were really kind of dense, and it took them a long time to learn new words in a situation that we thought we were being very clear and giving them a lot of input, and they simply failed to learn most of the words we were teaching them. So I kind of started questioning whether children really do have these specialized word learning abilities. And the study we ended up doing, we really decided we had to compare kind of head-to-head how quickly children learn words versus other kinds of information. So we taught children either words or facts or pictograms, which are abstract visual symbols. Okay, they don't necessarily have any meaning to you, but you can learn to relate them to something else, like say a brand logo or something like that. You've learned to associate with McDonald's or Starbucks or whatever, but initially, the yellow M arches doesn't have anything to do with hamburgers and French fries, right? So,
did you send us examples of your stimuli or pictograms, or?
Yeah, I think that's in slide number 4. So I don't know if you want to display that.
Yeah.
Right. So on the lower right of your screen, you see these 4 pictograms, which are just these sort of random symbols that we came up with.
You're asking children to associate these pictograms with objects, correct? Right,
and those are examples of objects that we were teaching kids either pictograms or words or facts for, right? And so either the words or the pictograms or the facts are novel information. Kids don't already know names for these words, names for these objects. So the question is, how quickly could they learn the information? And what we found in several experiments is that by any measure of learning, children never learn the words faster than they learn the facts or the pictograms, but sometimes they learn facts or pictograms faster than they learn words. And so, I don't know, if you show the next slide, that's one of our results. So that's from a learning task, and if you look on the x-axis, those are results from kids who were taught either words or facts with a novel word embedded in them, or pictograms. And what you can see is that basically either the facts or pictograms were learned even from the first couple of exposures faster than the words, and by the third and fourth exposure, they even could remember a fact with a novel word embedded in it better than just a word for the object. Okay?
How old are these kids?
In that experiment, it was 4 and 5-year-olds,
okay.
And we find similar results pretty much for 3-year-olds. And there are other studies from a couple of other labs. Jane Childers and Lauren Namey have results that are kind of compatible with these with 2-year-old children. So this is not an isolated finding from a single experiment. We replicated it a few times, and of course there are different conditions that change the results a little bit. But the basic pattern is that we never found a situation where kids were learning words faster than facts or pictograms, and what's more, we compared children to adults head to head. So everyone thinks, oh, little kids are great at learning languages, but I'm terrible at learning languages, okay? So I'm outside of my critical period. And the whole concept of critical periods for learning language is a pretty tricky concept. And you hear people make claims that aren't really well supported by the data. But at any rate, we couldn't find any result where people actually compared little kids and adults directly in how quickly they could learn words or pictograms, let's say. And what we found is that adults really greatly outperform children. So in a controlled task, adults learn words, new words, much faster than preschool children.
There's actually a question that were the words nonsense words. And
these were all
cognitive neuroscience.
Words.
And
Yeah,
I think this is interesting because I always feel like, you know, when you're doing research with children, you have to explain parents, you know, we're using nonsense words, objects that kids have never seen before. And the reason why is so that you can actually make comparisons, you know, with adults and kids if everybody coming into the lab has no experience really with these objects or words. So it seems like most of the, you know, developmental labs do teach, you know, that are interested in learning, use nonsense words and objects.
Right. Some labs use foreign words. I like the idea of using foreign words because you could actually teach the real word for an object or an action or something. But you also want to make sure that the stimuli are controlled. So we use nonsense words because we were trying to pick the easiest to pronounce words and the most distinctive words that we possibly could, because we didn't want the criticism that, well, you just taught them really difficult words, or the words were really similar sounding, so they couldn't tell them apart. So we picked the easiest words and set up the easiest word learning task that we possibly could, okay? And even so, and even when we made the facts somewhat longer and a little harder to remember, there still was either an advantage for facts or no difference between words and facts by some measures. And we tested comprehension, we tested production of the words or facts or drawing of the pictograms, and we tested whether they would generalize the words or facts or pictograms to new instances, new objects that were similar to the ones they had seen before. And by all measures, children were sort of more facile dealing with new facts or pictograms than words, or at least no better with new words. And adults were much better than children.
You have several other studies I want to talk about, but can you speculate on what's going on here? Why would words maybe be more difficult?
Right. Well, so I think the way to refocus the question is not to talk about how children are specialized for word learning, but to talk about how the lexicon of natural languages, that is, the set of words that real languages use as basis for communication, how lexicons are a special kind of information, okay? And we have to learn thousands of words to be fluent speakers of a language. As adults, we don't learn many novel words unless we're like doing a language learning immersion experience, right? Because most of the words we hear are familiar. But take the perspective of a 1-year-old or 2-year-old or 3-year-old kid. If they're listening to adults speak, they're hearing tons of novel words. So those statistics that suggest that little kids learn a lot of words every day aren't making a sort of fair comparison, right? The fair comparison would be if you took an adult and you plop them in, the home of a foreign language speaking family, and now they have to communicate, and they need these people to do everything for them because they're kind of more or less helpless, right? And then the question is, how quickly would you pick up words in this sort of situation where you're really dependent on it to function, in this social environment? And so my hypothesis would be that in that situation, adults do at least as well as kids, but little kids have a lot of opportunities to learn new words because they don't know as many as we do. And there's a lot of structure to the vocabulary of natural languages, okay? So there's a lot of arbitrariness in how we map sound patterns onto reference, things that we want to talk about in languages, but there's also some systematicity. So if I use a word like, if I say, I planted a treelet, maybe you've never heard the word treelet before, but you know something about the structure of English, and that tag at the end, the L-E-T, the let, probably gives you some hypotheses about what a treelet might be, right? A small tree, even though you've never heard that before. But you know a lot about the structure of English, right?
Right.
So that helps you decipher that information.
So it seems like we're talking really about the cognitive aspects of word learning, maybe biases that we have, but you also have quite a bit of work now looking more at kind of the interaction. I'm wondering if you can kind of go into some of this research that you've been doing, looking at the parent-child interaction in various settings.
Yeah. So we were also doing a lot of research on how children learn social skills that help them engage in what's called shared attention with adults. So shared attention is this sort of category of interactions or quality of interactions that allows people to focus on the same thing. It helps people communicate, it helps us cooperate in shared activities, and it's really a basis for all teaching and learning. So attention sharing skills are really important in social development, and they help infants with things like word learning and skill learning and learning social routines. So we wanted to know how infants learn the social skills that are going to help them learn language and everything else that they need to learn to be competent members of their culture. So we did some experimental studies of attention sharing in infants and discovered some things there. But I grew sort of more and more dissatisfied with how we were testing attention sharing in the lab. They seemed to be pretty, I guess, artificial tasks. So I decided we have to, get out of the lab, and I started doing what's called cognitive ethnography research, where you actually go into the world, outside the lab, into real environments where you find people interacting, and you try to systematically record how they're interacting. So we went into families' homes and, as I mentioned before, recorded parents and infants playing together. And the question was, what's happening during those interactions? What's the information that's kind of contained in the structure of those interactions that could help infants learn new social skills? Again, social skills that are going to help them learn whatever, language, social routines, tool using skills, all kinds of things. And so we've done a lot of analyses of those, and I see we have a couple questions. I don't know if I should circle back or.
It's up to you. We can come back to them, or some of them are pretty relevant right now if you want to.
I see my friend Andre has asked a question about first and second language learning. Andre, let me try to come back to that a little later, because the L1, L2 monolingual, bilingual language learning questions are great, and it's a fascinating area. So let's see if we have time and maybe circle back around to that, if that's okay. But I guess sticking with for the moment with infant-parent interaction, maybe we can show people what that looks like.
Okay.
So let's see if we could show Budini. It's numbered slide 10. So these are just screenshots of interactions of parents and infants at home in our first study, our first foray into cognitive ethnography of infant-parent interaction. And what we found in that study, or one of the first things we found that we were kind of excited by, is, if you look at the literature on infant social attention and social engagement, you get the impression that infants are really fascinated by adults' faces. Okay? There's a big literature on infants' face processing and how infants look at faces and look away from faces and what features of faces attract their attention, that sort of thing. What we found when we actually recorded infants at home is that they don't spend so much time looking at their parent's face. And then, I guess, Budini, if you put up the next slide, which is kind of complicated, but I'll try to unpack it. I hope people can see it. They may have to expand their window. But let me try to explain. If you look on the left bunch of tall bars, that's the proportion of time during naturalistic interactions when infants are looking at either static objects or objects in their mother's hand, objects that the mother is holding and manipulating. And without going into too much detail, let me just point out that when parents are holding objects, and infants can see this, that is the most interesting thing for infants to look at. Okay? There are some kind of moderate individual differences, but basically every infant we study would rather look at an adult handling an object than at the adult's face under most circumstances. Okay? And that's now been replicated in a couple of other labs. Of course, there are contextual factors that matter, but the point is that for decades, researchers studying infant social development were focusing on infants' processing of faces, which is no doubt important, but nobody had realized that infants are actually much more interested in watching parents' hands. Now, they're not interested in empty hands. They're interested in hands doing things with things. Okay, so this is kind of a new finding that now several labs are very interested in and are following up on to figure out what is it that babies are picking up on from watching people do things. Are they learning tool-using skills? Are they learning practical behaviors? So that's one of the findings that we are interested in. Another thing that we found is that in naturalistic interactions, there's almost no gaze following. Now let me background that a little bit. People who study attention-sharing behaviors in infants have been really focused on gaze following. That is, how do babies learn to follow another person's line of gaze to see what that person is looking at? Now you can imagine that for a baby who doesn't know what's really interesting and important in an environment, this could be really useful, right? You have adults around who know what's interesting and important in an environment. And if you can figure out what they're looking at, you might be able to sort of shortcut learning what's important in the environment. So people, including us, had studied gaze following quite a bit. And now I'm going to say that I actually don't think gaze following plays that critical a role all the time in everyday social interactions. There's just a little bit of gaze following in older infants kind of approaching a year, or in the last half of their first year. Okay. Babies will also follow pointing gestures by the last half of the first year. Okay. But what really gets babies' attention is when somebody picks up an object and starts doing something with it. Okay.
That is interesting. Because normally you open up a textbook, or it's all faces or special. Infants prefer faces over anything else. So it is a really interesting and important finding. So we have...
Parents, I will say parents look at infants' faces a lot when they're interacting face-to-face. Okay, not, of course, when they're doing the dishes or something, but, but when you're sitting playing with an infant, adults spend a lot of time looking at the infant's face, and you actually see that, Budini, if you put up the next slide. So we also code what moms look at, and moms in face-to-face play interactions spend a large majority of the time, like 80% of the time, they're watching the baby's face. Okay, so there's not much gaze following for babies to follow if parents are mostly looking at the baby's face. But in spite of that, babies eventually do learn to follow gaze. And if you read our paper that just came out this year, and I think you would put the link up to that, Chris, our paper in Developmental Science, you'll see we did statistical analyses based on patterns of actions in these home interactions, and we showed that statistically there was sufficient information for babies to eventually learn associations between adults' head pose, looking to the left or looking to the right, and the location of interesting things. Okay, where is it likely that I'm going to see something interesting? So they can learn associations between other people's head directions or eye directions and locations of interesting things. And that's work that I did with Anna Krasno and Jochen Triesch and Hector Jasso and Josh Lewis and Lisa Pita, I should say.
I'm wondering if we can sneak in 2 questions real quick, and I'd like to briefly get into your EEG study. We may run over a couple minutes, but I think it'd be really interesting. So this is actually Jay's question. How do you take into account, like different attachment styles? Are you looking at this at all, or?
Yeah, I saw that question. So Jay asks a really good question about whether we code quality of attachment between the infant and the caregiver. And this is an idea that goes back to a guy who I think was really brilliant, John Bowlby, and then Mary Ainsworth did very influential work following up, characterizing the quality of the relationship between infants and their caregivers. And Mary Ainsworth came up with a method, a measure of the quality of attachment. We have not looked at quality of attachment, although that would be a really reasonable thing to look at for some of the studies that we do, and it would be really reasonable to expect that we'd find different patterns of actions, of moment-to-moment actions, in infant-parent dyads where there was a secure attachment relationship versus dyads where there's an insecure attachment relationship of one kind or another. We have not done those analyses. What we've done some of is looking at individual differences between parents, across parents I should say, in how they interact with their infants, and are those individual differences stable? And we've looked at some consequences, for example, in the infant's language skills later on. So whether how parent interacts with their infant early on predicts any differences in language months later. Okay, but we have not measured attachment quality. That is something we could potentially do in the future. It's a good question.
So last question before we move on. This is Sabil's question about why infants aren't really looking at the face most of the time. Is it because the face is so highly familiar for them? And it may be related to attachment as well. So you could imagine if you were to do this, run the same study in the lab with a novel experimenter. Do you think that you're still going to see that interest in the object, or because the experimenter is new and the baby doesn't know, are you going to get more looking to the face?
Yeah, those are really good questions. There are a bunch of questions about how the context of interaction, who the adult is, who the owner of the face is, right, and then what the face is doing, and what else is going on in the interaction, how those things matter. For example, if the face starts making sounds, you know, if the adult starts talking, does that get the baby's attention? Certainly, we expect that infants' looks at faces are not randomly distributed, right? There are going to be situations where, like peekaboo, okay, where the infant is really focused on the face. And in other situations, you know, if you pick up the shiny keys and dangle them, you know, shake them in front of a young infant, they're going to be really fixated on the object. And labs that are studying this now are really trying to work out what are those factors, what are the parameters that determine how much babies are looking at faces and when they're looking at faces and what information they're picking up. I mean, that's what I'm really interested in is, you know, when the baby looks at the hands or the baby looks at the face or the baby looks at a static object in the environment or something else, right? What got them to look at it, and then what information are they getting out of that? Okay, and we say, what information are they getting? You know, we can ask that about moment to moment, you know, in this couple of seconds, what is the baby learning? But cumulatively, over days and weeks and months, what patterns is the baby learning about how people behave? You know, when people show a certain facial expression, what sorts of things are they likely to say? Or when they pick up an object and move it, right? Are they going to say something about this object, or are they going to do something with this object? What's their attitude towards that object, right? There are a lot of kinds of contingencies that might be available in the day-to-day interactions that infants are participating in and that they're witnessing between adults. And we know very little about what they're learning during those episodes. But I don't want to give the impression that babies are just indifferent to faces, okay? Mm-hmm. It's not that they're indifferent to faces. They don't spend a lot of time looking at it, and I think Sabiul's question is a good one that, you know, they know a lot about their caregiver's face by, you know, a certain age. And the face might not be the most informative thing to look at most of the time, right? Sometimes it might be, if you're not sure, if you're in a, you know, emotionally tense situation, or you have a caregiver who's unpredictable, to go back to the questions about attachment classification, then the face might be a very important and useful source of information, and you might find babies looking at it more. So if you know, wanted to make a hypothesis, one hypothesis is that certain insecurely attached infants might spend more time looking at their caregiver's face, right? That's what Bowlby and Ainsworth would predict. We haven't done that study, but it's an interesting question.
And we are already over time, but okay. I'm really wondering if you could spend a few minutes talking about your EEG study.
Right. So let's see. Maybe the best thing then is to go to slide 19, which shows images from our old experimental setup, our first experimental setup. Excuse me. And this was a study that was done by Liu, who's now an associate professor at Soochow University, and Scott McCaig at the Schwartz Center for Computational Neuroscience. Those are our partners in this study. And Zeynep Aklenekar. And so what we wanted to do is something that really hadn't been done before. You know, we know that the brain is developing in lots of ways during infancy and early childhood, and we know that social interactions are changing a lot during the same period. And it's an assumption that we all make that there's some relationship between how the brain is changing and how social relations are changing. But nobody had been able to sort of look at brain activity during real social interactions. And that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to see or record physiological evidence of, you know, patterns of brain activity as children or infants and adults are interacting. And this is very difficult because most methods for measuring brain activity really don't allow you to move much or interact with other people except in really strange ways, like you can yell to the person in an fMRI magnet or something like that. But we wanted to set up a paradigm where people could interact in some fairly natural ways while we're recording EEG, which, as I mentioned before, is electroencephalogram, and in EEG, which is a method that goes back about a century, almost a century, you're measuring small changes, very small changes in voltage on the surface of the scalp, and those changes reflect multiple sources. They can reflect changes in muscles, like, for example, the heart muscle. That's what an ECG is, an electrocardiogram. Okay, they can measure electrical fields in the environment. We hope not to measure many of those, but sometimes that happens. But the thing we're really interested in measuring is changes in the electrical signal created by certain cells in the cortex of the brain. Okay, and when enough cells in the cortex of the brain fire in synchrony, they produce a signal that, if amplified, is just large enough to be detected on the surface of the scalp. Okay, if you measure it carefully. So that's what EEG is, and that's what we're measuring. And in these pictures you see, we measured from toddlers and their parents simultaneously, and the innovation we were able to realize through the sort of amazing software they're developing at the Schwartz Center is that we can synchronize the EEG between two participants, so we can look at how their brain activity, their cortical brain activity, is changing simultaneously, okay, in real time as they're playing these games. And the other thing is, it's a little hard to see from the pictures, but they're wearing optical markers on their wrists and on their heads, and we have a motion tracking system, which you can't really see in the picture, but it's measuring the location of their hands and heads, and that data is getting integrated with the EEG data so that we know where their hands and heads are while they're playing this game. And they're playing the game, they're popping bubbles on a touchscreen table, and so... And
we'll post links to the video after. Okay. Of two people playing this game.
Right. So we have a video from our new setup, which is much better. So what we had toddlers and adults do is play this turn-taking game. They're taking turns popping bubbles on this touch screen, virtual bubbles, and when they match each other, when they take turns and pop the same bubble, they get one sort of outcome, one sort of appealing pop sound and video, and if they mismatch each other, if they change and pop the other bubble, they get a different sort of less salient outcome. And what we're really interested in here is partly how they play the game. It's a turn-taking game. We don't know a lot about how infants and toddlers learn turn-taking routines, but they actually really like this game, and they'll play this for well over 100 trials, or in some cases 200 or more trials. So you get a lot of EEG data, which is great. We can look at the changes in the toddler's EEG profile, let's say, when they make a move and reach out and pop a bubble. And then we can also look at changes in the EEG when they watch their mom reach out and touch the bubble. And because we're tracking the mom's motion as well as the baby's motion, we know exactly when the baby is reaching out and touching a bubble, and when they're seeing the pop or the other event, or when they see the mom reach out and touch the bubble or the other event. And one of the first things we looked at, I should say Dr. Leo looked at, was a phenomenon called mu suppression. And mu suppression is a suppression, a reduction in the amplitude of the voltage of oscillations emitting from part of the brain called the somatosensory cortex. This is part of the brain that's taking input from all your limbs and muscles, and it knows how you're moving and where your limbs are and how contracted your muscles are and things like that. and mu simply refers to a certain frequency and profile of oscillations, frequency in kids about 7 to 10 hertz. And what's important about that is just that we know that when people start to make a deliberate movement, like reaching to touch a touch screen, there is a reduction in power in this frequency band, okay? And that's because all of these cortical neuron columns of pyramidal cells especially, desynchronize because there's a lot going on. And that desynchronization causes a reduction in the overall oscillatory rhythmicity. Okay, so you get a reduction in power. Okay, sorry, that's a little technical. Anyway, what's important about mu suppression is that you not only get this phenomenon in adults when the subject is making a movement, but if they watch another person make a movement, you will see mu suppression. So we presume that the same brain source generators, okay, that are registering when we're acting ourselves in a certain way also get trained up to respond when we see another person making the kind of action that we could make, okay? So this is part of a neural network that, among other things, helps us make associations between our own actions and other people's actions. And you can imagine this might be really important for infants and toddlers, right? They have to learn to interpret other people's actions. They need to be able to relate the kinds of things that they do or want to do with the kinds of things that they see other people doing, okay? So people have been interested in how that brain network or those brain networks develop, and mu suppression is sort of an EEG signature of one part of that system, let's say. So what we did find was that, let's see, maybe if we could jump to, let's see, what do we have time to set up? Slide 21. Okay, and then let me try to explain this. I have to skip over a lot of details of how we analyze the EEG data. But what this is showing is for independent components in the EEG data, I don't really have time to explain that, but for sort of segments of related activity in the total EEG record, okay, that showed all of the properties of mu suppression that you would expect in adults, okay? What we've plotted here is the power frequency, the power density across this frequency range, like from 0 to 30 hertz, okay? Now, what I want to point out is that the blue line is the power during periods when neither the toddler nor the mother were acting. So there was no action going on, and what you can see is that power in that mu frequency band, about 7 to 10 hertz, is relatively high, okay? And there's also, for EEG people, there's also a little beta peak there, which is also something you expect and nobody had looked at in babies, but never mind, that's a little technical, okay? Now, look at the red line. That's action execution. Those are the periods where the toddler was reaching out and touching the bubble, okay? And you see suppression there. There's less power in the red line in the mu band and in the beta band, up around 16 to 18 hertz, okay? Then there is in the no action profile, the no action average. Okay, now here's the thing we were interested in. Look at the green line. That's action execution. Those are the periods where the mother was reaching and touching the bubble. And what you find is that there's a significant decrease in mu power, okay, during the times when the toddler was seeing the mom reach out and touch the bubble. That's mu suppression. We were able to rule out, which some previous studies had kind of tried and hadn't done really always very well, but we were able to rule out that the baby was moving or talking during those periods using video from 3 angles and the baby's motion tracking sensor. So, so we know that the baby wasn't acting, wasn't behaving during those times. So that's mu suppression in 2-year-olds. And then if you back up to the slide before it, now this gets a little bit more complicated, but let me just say that look at the bottom half. Those green dots are the mappings of 11 independent components from the independent component analysis that we did of the EEG data. And I'm sorry I don't have more time to explain that, but that's a method for decomposing this very complicated mixture of signals that you get in EEG to find coherent sources of sort of related activity, okay? And so green indicates the most likely location of a generator for independent components taken from 11 toddlers, okay? And to figure that out, there are very complicated models that you can use to do source localization from EEG. Source localization, that is localization of brain sources from EEG is a little bit controversial, okay, because EEG doesn't have the greatest spatial resolution. But what we did is we took structural MRI scans of the brains of a bunch of same-age children provided by John Richards at a University of South Carolina, and we made a head model, an age-appropriate head model, and then we mapped our EEG results from the kids in our study onto this sort of age-appropriate head model. And then these green dots indicate the best solution of the most likely location for the components that showed all of the other properties consistent with mu suppression. And where they cluster, as you can see, they're not all over the place. They're not outside the skull. They're not in the cerebellum. Okay, where they are is exactly where you expect sources of mu suppression in adults. Okay, but this is in a child-sized brain model. And then the red dot in the middle, if you can kind of see, is the average of all those components. So that's a sort of invented or imputed, not a real component, but it's an average. But that's coming from the area of the brain, the post-central sulcus, where you expect somatotopic representations of roughly, the hand and arm. So that's what we would expect. That's on left hemisphere. There was another cluster of components on the right hemisphere, but they were doing the task with their right hand. So we expected to find more coherent sources on the left hemisphere, and that's indeed what we found. So this is kind of the first really clear, converging evidence of mu suppression related to specific actions in toddlers. There are a few other studies that have looked at mu suppression in infants and children, but they maybe don't go quite so far in looking at all the different sources of data, and in some cases you can't really tell whether it was in fact mu suppression that was observed. So this is the first evidence that 3-year-olds show kind of all the properties of mu suppression that you find in adults.
So I know that the data are really hot off the press. Do you have a poster or something that we can provide if people need more details on kind of the methodology and how you analyze the data?
Yeah, I should mention that these findings are still under review, so they're not published yet. We have a couple of posters, and I can send you a conference poster from Human Brain Mapping a year or two ago, and that provides more detail. And then if people want even more detail, they can contact me, and maybe you can, if you put up our lab website, there's more information on our new lab website, so they can get more information there, and they can actually download the posters there as well.
Great. Excellent research. Last question. We're way over time. I'm stealing this from Ginger Campbell of Brain Science podcast. Yeah. And she really asked, do you have any advice? So if anybody, there are students potentially watching this, maybe thinking about going into undergrad in psychology or graduate school, do you have any advice for them to help prepare them for either graduate school or getting a career choice? Any little tips that you could provide?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, it's a difficult decision these days to decide whether to pursue a PhD, right? And so I would say, first of all, do a lot of homework about what kind of PhD program you might want to go into, and different universities and labs. And you can't do too much research to try to figure out a good place. But if you're an undergraduate, you know, the two biggest pieces of advice I would say are find a good lab to get involved in, and don't be shy about contacting faculty. You know, I usually have somewhere between 12 and 20 undergraduates working in my lab, and motivated, smart undergraduates really are critical for our research program, and you can learn a lot working in labs. So get that experience, and for one thing, you're finding out whether you actually want to do research as a career. It's not for everyone, right? And there are lots of other really worthy things to do. So figure out if it's what you want to do. The other thing I would say is, you know, take as much math and biology as you can, and some computer science too, at least so you're comfortable, you know, learning a new programming language. But definitely take as much math and bio as you can, right? If you have electives, rather than taking history of heavy metal or something like that, that's a cool class, right? I mean, I'd like to take that, but maybe instead take something on, you know, cellular microbiology or linear algebra or something like that. That will never, it'll never, you know, serve you poorly.
Excellent advice. So we are out of time. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to talk to us. Also for being a guinea pig. You're the first person to participate in this series, so we're still kind of working out, you know, what's the best way to present it. We went a little over, 20 minutes over, but I thought it was interesting, very interesting. So
thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed this. It's been fun talking with you both, and thank you to everyone who took time out of their day to listen in and hear about some of the research we're doing.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll post some of the questions we didn't get to. I'll try to get to those. We'll also post videos of participants doing the task, links to your website. We'll make sure all that's on the event post for everyone. So thank you for watching. Talk to you later.
Thank you. Take care.